My name is Dr. Samuel Keller, and I used to believe that death was the end of every story. After 32 years as a veterinarian, after watching countless animals take their final breaths in my arms, I thought I understood the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond it. I was wrong. Some stories don't end when the heart stops beating. Some stories are just waiting for the right voice to tell them. The morning they brought her in, the August heat was already pressing against the clinic windows like something alive trying to get inside. I'd been at work since 5 a.m., not because I had surgeries scheduled, but because sleep had become impossible. 3 months since Sarah's funeral, and our house still echoed with conversations that would never finish. Laughter that had been cut short by cancer's cruel precision. The animals seemed to sense my grief. Even the most anxious dogs would quiet when I entered the room, as if they understood that I was carrying something fragile and didn't want to disturb it with unnecessary noise. I was reviewing charts when Officer Martinez called. His voice carried that careful tone people use when they're trying to sound professional about something that doesn't fit into professional categories. Doc Keller, we've got a situation at the old St. Mary's Chapel on Elm Street. There's a dog, been there since yesterday morning, pacing back and forth in front of the building, barking at nothing we can see. I knew St. Mary's. Everyone in town knew it, though most of us tried not to think about it. The stone chapel had been beautiful once before the fire 15 years ago gutted the interior and left the windows like empty eye sockets staring out at the street. The church board had sealed it up after the investigation concluded, but they'd never torn it down. Something about insurance disputes and historical preservation. It sat there like a wound that wouldn't heal, collecting dust and rumors. How long has she been barking? I asked, already reaching for my keys. 17 hours, give or take. Same pattern, over and over. 4 barks, then silence. 4 barks, then silence. Mrs. Chen across the street called it in. Says it's keeping the whole neighborhood awake, but... He paused. Doc, I've been watching her for an hour now. She's not barking at cars or people or other animals. She's barking at empty air. Like she's having a conversation with something that isn't there. The drive to St. Mary's took 12 minutes through streets that shimmered with heat mirages. When I pulled up, I could see the dog immediately. She was standing in the narrow strip of shade cast by the chapel's bell tower, a medium-sized shepherd mix with fur the color of charcoal and ash. Her coat was matted, dusty, like she'd been rolling in the ruins of something burned. But it was her posture that made my breath catch. She wasn't pacing anxiously like most strays. She was standing at attention, perfectly still, facing the boarded-up front doors of the chapel. As I watched, she tilted her head slightly upward and barked. 4 sharp, clear sounds that seemed to hang in the humid air longer than they should have. Then silence. Exactly 63 seconds later, she barked again. Same rhythm, same tone, same impossible precision. I approached slowly, my medical bag heavy in my left hand, my right extended in the universal gesture of peace that usually calms frightened animals. She didn't acknowledge my presence until I was close enough to see her eyes clearly. They were brown, almost black, but there was something in them that made my steps falter. Not fear or aggression, but a kind of infinite sadness that reminded me of Sarah's eyes in those final weeks when the morphine couldn't touch the deeper pain. Hey there, girl, I said softly. What are you looking at? She turned to face me then, and I felt something shift in the air between us. Recognition, maybe, or simply the weight of one grieving soul acknowledging another. She didn't bark at me. Instead, she walked over and sat down directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the ash in her fur and see the small cuts on her paw pads where she'd been walking on broken glass or debris. Getting her into the van was surprisingly easy. She followed me without resistance, settled into the carrier without complaint. But as we drove away from St. Mary's, she pressed her face against the rear window and whimpered once, a sound so human and heartbroken that I had to pull over and sit in the driver's seat for 5 minutes before I could trust myself to continue. Back at the clinic, my staff gathered around as I carried her inside. Jenny, my head technician, had been with me for 8 years and had seen every kind of animal trauma imaginable, but even she stepped back when the dog turned those impossibly sad eyes in her direction. What's her story? Jenny asked, her voice dropping to a whisper without her seeming to notice. Found her at St. Mary's. Been barking at the building for almost a day straight. I settled the dog into our largest kennel, lined it with soft blankets, filled water and food bowls. She ignored everything except the blankets, which she arranged in a perfect circle before lying down in the center, facing east toward the wall where we kept our emergency supplies. St. Mary's? Dr. Rodriguez, our newest associate, looked up from the chart he was reviewing. That place gives me the creeps. My grandmother used to say it was cursed after the fire. I didn't believe in curses, but I'd started to believe in the way grief could reshape reality, make impossible things seem suddenly plausible. I ran my hands over the dog's body, checking for injuries, parasites, signs of abuse. Her vitals were normal, her body condition fair considering she'd likely been without regular meals for weeks. But when I tried to examine her mouth, she pulled back and barked. 4 times. Same rhythm as before. "I'm going to call her Mercy," I said, not sure where the name came from. The moment I spoke it, she went completely still. For the first time since I'd found her, she blinked slowly, deliberately, and the tension in her body seemed to ease just slightly. Over the next few days, I established a routine of sitting with Mercy during my lunch breaks. Not examining her, not trying to treat anything specific, just sitting on the floor outside her kennel and eating my sandwich while she watched me with those ancient, sorrowful eyes. She barked every hour, always the same pattern, always directed at empty air or blank walls. The staff started avoiding the kennel room after 3 p.m., when the afternoon light slanted through the windows and made shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "She's waiting for something," Jenny said one evening as we were closing up. Or someone. "I've never seen an animal so focused, like she has a job to do and she's not going to rest until it's finished." I started staying late, ostensibly to catch up on paperwork, but really to observe Mercy when the clinic was quiet and empty. At night, her behavior became even more ritualized. Every hour on the hour, she would stand up, face a different direction, and bark 4 times. North at midnight, east at 1 a.m., south at 2, west at 3, then the pattern would repeat. It was as if she was calling to the 4 corners of the world, or marking some kind of spiritual territory I couldn't see or understand. One night, exhausted and grieving and desperate for any kind of connection, I brought my guitar to work. I'd played in church for years before Sarah got sick, before I lost faith in anything that couldn't be measured or healed with medicine. I sat outside Mercy's kennel and played Amazing Grace, the hymn Sarah had hummed while she did dishes, while she folded laundry, while she fought cancer with a grace I'd never possessed. Mercy's reaction was immediate and devastating. She pressed herself against the kennel door and whimpered, a sound so filled with longing and loss that I had to stop playing. When I put the guitar down and knelt on the floor, she pushed her paw through the wire mesh and touched my hand. Her paw pad was warm and rough, and somehow familiar, like I'd felt that exact touch before in a dream I couldn't quite remember. "What are you trying to tell me?" I whispered. She looked directly into my eyes and whimpered again, softer this time, almost like she was trying to comfort me instead of asking for comfort herself. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after I'd found her. I'd finally managed to sedate her enough to perform a thorough oral examination, something that had proven impossible while she was conscious. Her mouth had seemed normal during my initial visual inspections, but I wanted to check for dental disease, foreign objects, anything that might explain her unusual vocalizations. What I found defied every principle of veterinary medicine I'd ever learned. Etched into the roof of her mouth, precise as a tattoo but glowing with its own faint light, was a symbol unlike anything I'd ever seen. It looked like a combination of Celtic knotwork and mathematical equations, lines that curved and intersected in patterns that made my eyes water if I stared too long. The symbol pulsed gently, synchronized with her heartbeat, and as I watched, transfixed and terrified, it seemed to be growing. New lines appearing at the edges, the pattern becoming more complex with each breath she took. I fell to my knees beside the examination table, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the penlight steady. The room spun around me, and in that moment of disorientation, I heard something that changed everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. A voice. Not spoken aloud, but whispered directly into my mind with a clarity that made my own thoughts seem dim by comparison. "Help me." 2 words that carried the weight of desperate hope and ancient sorrow. 2 words that somehow sounded exactly like Sarah's voice on the day she died, when she'd gripped my hand and whispered the same plea before the machines went silent. I staggered out of the examination room and locked myself in my office, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Stress, grief, sleep deprivation. The mind could create elaborate hallucinations when pushed to its limits, could make us hear voices that weren't there, see patterns where none existed. But when I returned to check on Mercy an hour later, the symbol was still there, still glowing, still growing. That night, I dreamed of fire and screams and a woman who looked like Sarah running through smoke-filled corridors with a journal clutched against her chest and a black dog at her side. In the dream, the woman was trying to reach a group of children trapped in a basement while something dark and hungry pressed against the walls, trying to break through from somewhere else. The dog barked 4 times and the darkness retreated. The woman pressed her hand against the dog's mouth, and I saw the symbol appear like a brand, sealing something away that was too terrible to name. I woke up sobbing, my pillow soaked with tears I didn't remember shedding. The dream felt more real than my waking life, more vivid than any memory I possessed. I could still smell the smoke, still hear the children crying, still feel the woman's desperate determination to save them no matter the cost. The next morning, I drove to the public library and spent 3 hours researching the history of St. Mary's Chapel. Most of what I found was standard local history, the kind of sanitized information that appears in newspaper archives and city records. The chapel had been built in 1892, served the community faithfully for over a century, suffered significant damage in a fire of unknown origin 15 years ago. The building had been sealed pending renovation that had never materialized. But buried in a folder of police reports from that time, I found something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A statement from a 7-year-old girl named Rebecca Santos, who claimed she'd been pulled from the burning chapel by a black dog with fire in her mouth. According to the report, Rebecca described the dog as appearing in the basement where she and 6 other children had been trapped, barking 4 times to drive away the shadow things that wanted to take us home with them. The dog had led the children through passages that shouldn't have existed, upstairs that weren't on any building plan, to safety through a door that couldn't be found again once the fire was extinguished. Rebecca Santos had disappeared from the hospital 2 days later. No trace of her was ever found. Neither was the dog. I stared at that police report for so long the words began to blur together, but one phrase kept jumping out at me like a neon sign. Fire in her mouth. The same mouth where I'd found that impossible, glowing symbol. The same mouth that spoke words directly into my mind in my dead wife's voice. When I returned to the clinic that afternoon, I found chaos. The building had been broken into sometime during lunch, but nothing was missing. No drugs stolen, no equipment damaged, no money taken from the register. The only sign of intrusion was Mercy's kennel door, which stood wide open even though she was still inside, sitting calmly in the center of her blankets as if nothing had happened. Jenny was shaking as she showed me around. She never left, Doc. We got here and found the door open, but she was just sitting there like she was waiting for us. Like she'd opened it herself and then decided to stay. On the floor beside her kennel, I found a piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from an old book. The edges were blackened with age or fire damage, and the text was written in a spidery handwriting I didn't recognize. But the symbol at the top of the page was identical to the one in Mercy's mouth, and below it, in English, someone had written, "The voice is returning. The gate must stay closed." I knelt in front of Mercy's kennel, that piece of paper trembling in my hands. She looked at me with those infinitely sad eyes, and for the first time since I'd found her, she didn't bark. Instead, she tilted her head and made a sound I'd never heard from her before, a soft whine that sounded almost like singing. "What are you?" I whispered. She stood up and walked to the front of her kennel, pressing her nose against the wire mesh that separated us. When I reached out to touch her, she licked my fingers, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her body temperature. It was the warmth of recognition, of connection, of something that transcended the physical world and reached into places I'd thought were sealed forever by death and loss. That night, I brought a sleeping bag to the clinic and spent the night on the floor beside her kennel. She didn't bark once. Instead, she curled up as close to me as the wire would allow, and we slept peacefully for the first time in months. I dreamed of Sarah, but not the wasted, pain-racked woman who died in our bedroom. I dreamed of Sarah as she'd been when we first met, young and radiant and full of fierce protective love for every broken thing that crossed her path. In the dream, Sarah was standing in the ruins of St. Mary's Chapel, and she wasn't alone. 7 children stood behind her, holding hands in a circle, their faces glowing with the same soft light I'd seen in Mercy's mouth. And in the center of the circle sat Mercy. No longer a stray dog, but something ancient and purposeful. A guardian standing watch between the world of the living and whatever darkness pressed against the boundaries of death. "She's been waiting for you," Sarah said in the dream, her voice carrying across impossible distances. "Someone has to take over. Someone has to keep the gate closed." When I woke up, Mercy was standing at attention, facing the eastern wall, her body tense with anticipation or alarm. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of sirens, but they seemed to be moving away from us rather than toward us. Mercy barked once, sharply, and the siren stopped. In the morning, I found another piece of paper slipped under the clinic door. This one was newer, written in block letters with a black marker. "We know where she is. We're coming to take her home." I looked at Mercy, who was watching me with those ancient, knowing eyes, and I understood that our time together was borrowed. She hadn't wandered into my life by accident. She'd been sent, whether by my dead wife or some force I couldn't name, to help me understand that some bonds transcend death, that some love is strong enough to bridge the gap between this world and the next. But she was also here for another reason. She was a guardian, a keeper of boundaries, a voice that could drive back whatever darkness had tried to claim those children 15 years ago. And that darkness was still out there, still hungry, still trying to find a way through the gate she'd sealed with her sacrifice. I reached into her kennel and gently touched the top of her head. She leaned into my palm, and I felt that warmth again, that connection that made me believe in possibilities I'd thought were lost forever. "I understand now," I whispered, "but I don't know how to help you." She licked my hand once, then walked to the back of her kennel and lay down, her eyes fixed on the door. Waiting. Always. Waiting. But now I knew what she was waiting for, and the knowledge filled me with a terror and purpose I'd never experienced before. Someone was coming for her. Someone who wanted to silence the voice that kept the gate closed, who wanted to reclaim the guardian who stood between the living and the hungry dark. And when they came, I would be ready. Not because I understood the supernatural forces at work, but because I understood love. The kind of love that doesn't end with death, that reaches across impossible distances to protect what matters most. Mercy barked once, looking directly at me, and I heard Sarah's voice whisper in my mind, "Thank you." Outside, a car engine started in the distance, growing closer. Mercy's ears perked up, and the symbol in her mouth began to glow brighter, casting strange shadows on the kennel walls. She wasn't barking at nothing anymore. She was calling to reinforcements, summoning whatever power had sent her to me in the first place. The voice was returning, just like the note had warned. But this time, it wouldn't be silenced. This time, the gate would stay closed, no matter what tried to break it down. And I would stand guard beside her for as long as my strength lasted, protecting the protector who had somehow found her way back to a world that needed her more than it would ever know.